right, ladies and gentlemen, today what we're going to be talking about, and really only beginning to talk about, is the shape of Greece after the most ancient period that we studied a few days ago. This period that is especially ushered in by one of these pivotal figures in history, Alexander the Great. These is very new age, sometimes referred to as Hellenistic Greece. It is fair to say that altogether, starting in this period of 4th century BCE, that the history of the ancient Greek world will become a very new kind of creature. And really, the power, the kingdom that would change the composition of the Greek world, and really, in some sense, flush out this old system in which there were all these tiny little governments known as polises dotting the Greek landscape, was this northern kingdom, sometimes just known as Mastodon, is probably an easier way to refer to it. And this northern kingdom in the Greek world, an area that we think was very mountainous, rugged, and so far removed from the real center of Greek power that some of the traditional policies we discussed the other day, like Athens and Sparta, didn't even view them as really being Greek. They were just a bunch of barbarians living way up in this northern territory. But what you'll see, all of a sudden now today, Macedon takes center stage in changing the shape of the Greek world. The king in Macedon was responsible for making his kingdom really look far outside its former boundaries, is this man here known as Philip II. Philip II ruled over Macedon with an iron fist. He knew its territory, what it was good for, which in particular was good for fighting. They had a very strong warrior aristocracy, and had a long tradition of training and fighting before the war. But in comparison to some of the other Greek steady states that have these very developed governments, really the government up in Macedon was simple. In essence, you had a strong king, and if you wanted to rise in society, you needed some kind of link to the king. They didn't have all these sort of governmental institutions that other Greek city-states had. Although some people felt that the people of Macedon were not true Greeks, Philip II differed, as did his people. They said that they claimed that they had descent from the same sort of Greek ancestors everyone else did, and they said, in fact, we worship the same gods, we speak the same language, we too are Greek. Just because, though, Philip II had this great affinity for the Greek world, that did not stop him from wanting to conquer it. In fact, he loved Greece so well, he wanted to own all of it, is essentially what ends up happening. And the way he does this is he takes this army he has, that's already formidable when he comes to power, and he begins to train it. First of all, he begins to make sure that they're well equipped. One of the new tools, one of the new weapons he brings to bear, and you can see the schemata. These things here, these things that are referred to as a pike. A pike is basically a very long spear. It's normally carried with just one hand, and they really reach out quite far. Part of the devastating nature of these things is that if you were to meet these people on the battlefield, it's kind of like a porcupine. It's very difficult to even get close to them if they have these things. Please.
Are pikes what they use for jousting?
It's something slightly different in that most of the time in medieval Europe when they joust, these things are made entirely of wood. So they all have crack. And the pikes will actually have spears at the end of them. So they're meant to be deadly on purpose. Because jousting is not supposed to kill you. Ideally, it can. It does.
But it's like the similar size.
In terms of shape, size, it's also slightly different. We think one of the other ideas that Philip II introduces for his soldiers is that one of the ways you can be victorious is to just get there faster than anybody else. And one of the weapons he works with is surprise. He shows up before enemies know that he's coming. On top of that, Mastodon thinks a lot about how do you take walled cities, because a lot of these ancient cities would have been walled, and he thinks about new techniques to break sieges, to get into walled cities, including, for instance, using catapults to begin to toss things into these cities, to try to smash things from within, to try to undermine walls, to be able to break cities and to get in them and get their people and their things. At this point, and it goes exactly to the situation I told you about in the other class, where the Greek world had so exhausted itself, there was no longer all these very strong city-states willing to go out and to face Mastodon on the battlefield. Athens tried its best to cobble together an army to try to meet Philip on the battlefield, and it ended up proving to be disastrous to their cause. Once Philip II had essentially just rolled over most of the Greek world militarily, his next goal was he begins to look toward the east, to the Persian Empire. And it is possible that if Philip II had lived, he himself would very soon have to try to invade and take the Persian Empire. The man was ambitious, if nothing else. Unfortunately for Philip II, where are we? He ends up going the way of all flesh. Again, he ends up being assassinated. What ends up happening then is very quickly Macedon is thrown into a state of confusion, inasmuch as now someone who they never planned on taking over the position of king had to very quickly adapt himself to becoming the king of Macedon. And this is someone who we'll talk more about on Friday, but it's important to talk about right now too. This is someone known as Alexander. Not initially the Great, he had to work for that title during his life. We think that in some sense, although Alexander takes over as a young man, and that caused many people to doubt his abilities, Alexander himself does not really show an ounce of humility. He wants to seize control of the reins of his kingdom, and he wants to do what his father had planned to do: dominate the Greek world, and then move forward to the east and take over that territory as well. So in essence, there ended up being very little interruption in this overall plan. But the Greek world didn't know that at first. Initially, when Alexander comes to power, some of the Greek city-states who were really not accustomed to being under the command of one central ruler said, "This is great. We can rebel." They don't have a strong leader in place. To give you just one example of this, helpfully they actually pointed out where this is. This is the city of Thebes. We haven't mentioned Thebes a lot earlier. It was actually one of the most highly developed city-states, policies in the Greek world. It was a very rich place. They had a shipbuilding business. And there was a lot of a culture there as well. In any case, though, unfortunately for Thebes, they decided that when Alexander came to power, they were going to revolt against his rule. And very quickly, they throw off the shackles of Macedonian domination. Alexander recognized that if he allowed this to happen, the rest of the Greek world would just decide that they didn't need him as well. And so very quickly, before the people of Thebes had a chance to really do much of anything else, he took his army, he marched to the gates of Thebes, he broke down their walls, he slaughtered a good deal of the population. Those that he did not slaughter, he chose to sell into slavery. He essentially said that he did not leave brick on top of brick. He absolutely razed Thebes to the ground. So it looks like this now. So notice what's happened here. Alexander has asserted himself, but this is the new way of life for Greek city-states now. They don't get to be independent anymore. They don't get their own government. Now Mastodon is going to call the shots, both internally, because they have to acknowledge the king, and externally. Because now he's going to take he's going to recruit troops from around the Greek world and take them now on a foreign expedition into the Persian Empire. At this point, at just 22 years old, it makes one weep a little bit to think what I've accomplished in my life with twice as much time. Alexander then begins this sort of brilliant series of conquests that really, in some ways, will put the Greek world, the Greek ancient world, on a much wider stage than it had ever been previously. We'll talk more about this later, but it is fair to say that part of Alexander's genius was in part military. He was that kind of person who, just like a good quarterback, who like scan the field and see what's about to happen rather than what's happening now. He had that ability with military expeditions, where he could look at a battle and very quickly recognize where the weaknesses of the enemy were. On top of that, though, we think he's also someone that people liked. He was charismatic. His people wanted to fight for him. It was said that he actually ended up taking a lot of risks in battle. Foolishly, some people felt, fighting at the forefront of some battles, because he wanted to be seen as someone who was taking the same risks as his own soldiers. Alexander's great conquest, of course, was that he actually lived out the dream of his father. He enters into the Persian Empire and quickly begins to win a series of brilliant battles over Persian armies that in some cases outclassed him in terms of numbers, but definitely not in terms of tactics. He starts beginning to mow down some of the Persians. There's just one famous mosaic that shows one of these battles, the Persians retreating in disarray versus Alexander constantly going forward. We can't go into detail, but just to give you a quick rundown, everything in red will in time end up becoming his personal property, stretching all the way from the Greek world up into modern-day India. In fact, even getting slightly into India. Egypt, he actually ends up taking as well, all of the Middle East. All of this ends up becoming Alexander's possession of Mastodon now. Yeah.
So any of those, hypothetically, any of those areas were conquered by Alexander the Great, and then we're like, oh no, we hate this idea, like we're gonna rebel. If they rebelled, would you just destroy them all over again?
Had he lived longer, that may well be what he would have done. What I'll just talk about in a second is that we'll never know what would have happened had he lived longer, and how he could have kept this mess together. Likely the answer is that people would have rebelled, and he would have had to react in some way, but we'll never know how. And part of depending on how you look at it, the good or bad thing about his conquest was that he never came up for air. This was a period of around 10 years where he was just conquering. So there was no even time practically to organize rebellions against him, because people barely knew what had happened to them. He came in so fast. We think, altogether, you will hear a lot sometimes discussions about what is the role of the individual in history. This is one of those rare cases where you can say that had Alexander never lived, the world would have been a very different place. Really, this is the mark of an individual. Again, for good or for ill, you don't necessarily have to agree with conquest being a good thing, but it certainly did change the face of the world in a very short period of time. And he may have been self-absorbed and totally obsessed with glory, but he was very effective at what he did, his day job, which is to say war. And it wasn't just a matter, too, of battles. Again, everyone always remembers the battles, but along the way, Alexander also was founding cities. Like, for instance, Alexandria in Egypt, the most famous one. Other cities, too, like Alexandria. He named 25 cities in Alexandria, so it was a little difficult to keep track of them by the end. So here, if you want some of these different Alexandrias, here goes this. The problem with all of this, you may say, well, this is awesome. Where can I join up? With all of this conquest, Alexander had given just about no thought to the very basic issue of how do you run an empire? Conquering is not the same thing as governing. And he very quickly runs out, really recognized that he had no ideas about how to govern these areas. What he would tend to do is, as he conquered, he would take one of his men, his general, and say, here you go, here's your territory, rule it. And these generals would proceed to fleece the natives of all their money. And that's all they knew how to do. They really didn't know how to run a government in any traditional sense. A few of the ideas that Alexander had to us seem just thrown out at the moment and crazy. Like, let's have all of my men marry Persian women, and that will bring the empire together. Which we can only imagine how these marriages worked out. They could not have been good. Another problem was that Alexander himself, as a result of all this glory, well, it begins to go to his head. He begins to think that no mere mortal could have accomplished what I accomplished. And in fact, he begins to view himself as a god on earth. And he demands to be worshipped as such. He begins to mint these coins, for instance, that show him with the skin of the lion that Hercules had killed. So it seems the implication seems to be that just as a Hercules became a full god as a result of his actions, Alexander basically had done the same exact thing because of his great conquest. Now, this was distasteful for many of the Macedonian soldiers who had fought with Alexander for a long time, because he begins to demand that people, use incense in front of him, kneel down before him. But that's not the way that Macedonian soldiers were used to treating their generals. They were basically drinking buddies with their generals. And now all of a sudden, the general was demanding to be treated like a god. And many people began to feel he was acting more like a Persian emperor rather than a Greek or Macedonian ruler. We think that quite rightly, Alexander begins to recognize that people are beginning to distrust him. And Alexander begins to feel that there are plots forming around every corner. In effect, he actually has several people who he accuses of being traitors killed after one night of particularly heavy drinking. There were lots of nights of drinking, but after one particular night of drinking, he ends up actually even killing someone who up to that point had been one of his good friends. So his behavior is beginning to look a little bit more erratic. In any case, very soon after, again, yet another night of hard partying, Alexander will end up collapsing and then dying. There was always whispers, both in antiquity and today, that this might have been in part poison, but no one's ever really proved that. And in fact, we don't even know exactly where Alexander's body is right now, so even if we couldn't really test it in any case. Part of the big problem with Alexander's death was that there was absolutely no governmental framework in place in any of these places that he had taken. When once Alexander was asked, well, who is going to be your heir if you die? He said, it should go to the strongest, which doesn't really help, in terms of forming a government. And so all of his generals, the smart ones, the competent ones, begin to quickly put together their own little armies, and they begin to fight with one another to try to slice off little portions of this empire for themselves, and they begin to rule it in their own names. I think almost everyone recognized that the empire the size of Alexander's could never stand unimpeded. So the question was, you had to get yours before the other generals got theirs, was essentially the attitude they came up with. So to give you just one example, for instance, Egypt now is ruled as its own individual country, with one of the general who had once fought Alexander just taking it over and ruling it now in his own name. And the urge to go native in Egypt is just, impossible to fight. So he, of course, begins to portray himself as a pharaoh, even though this was someone who was born in the Greek world. Very quickly that changed. And that's just one of the most famous examples. We begin to see all sorts of smaller kingdoms also beginning to pop up in what previously had been the territory that Alexander owned. In fact, many of these kinglets, these kings who take over what Alexander had taken a part of, they were on constant fighting with others. And they would get large armies, and they constantly would try to take one of those territories. So there was a lot of war even after Alexander was dead. Not to say being king was all bad. And we do think some of these new kingdoms that form in the wake of Alexander's conquest become extremely rich. In fact, these kings, these Greek kings who take over these territories, if nothing else, they were very good at things like taxation and finding ways to take money from the territories they now had. And so, in fact, they really lived in luxury. And every so often we have some of these products, like this is, for instance, a bracelet. These go on women's arms. They curl around. They're gold-plated. Nice things to have. Door knockers, if you like. If you don't. And again, some of these very elaborate sort of statues now, statuary end up being found in this period, very often funded by money that had been taken from these native countries and then funneled to artists. Some of these very famous pieces. It's fair to say, too, by the way, when Alexander started referring to him as a god, everyone thought this was gross. All of these kings now all refer to themselves as gods. Once Alexander started the precedent, now you get to be a god if you become a leader of one of these kingdoms. Not bad. Now, you may wonder, okay, what's the big payoff for all of this? Then who cares about Alexander's conquests? And it is fair to say that no one claims that this was really is a long-lasting empire. It wasn't. The thing that Alexander does, and does very well, is he ends up spreading Greek culture and civilization far beyond the bounds of the Aegean Sea and its origin. And in fact, Alexander even had planned for this in advance. He actually ended up taking with him all sorts of, for instance, historians and people who studied biology and architecture along with him on his conquests. And these people helped to create these new cities that would continue to perpetuate Greek culture long after Alexander was in the ground. And so things that, for instance, that would previously have been just features of the Aegean now were all over the place, stretching this much wider realm. Greek gymnasiums to Greek athletics would go up, all the way in what today is modern-day Eastern Turkey. People would do Greek sports. People would worship Greek gods. People would study Greek literature and the Greek language. So for some of you may wonder, why was the New Testament written in Greek? And the answer is not because Greek is some kind of fantastic language for communicating truth. It's because more people spoke Greek than any other language at the time in that area. And the reason for that is because Alexander the Great and taking Greek culture as far as he did. We see too that where Greeks went, there was a lot of economic life, and merchants also begin to spread in this far wider realm. I mean, this territory that previously Greeks didn't know existed. Now they were traveling to and trading on a regular basis. So their money also goes into these territories as well. And in some cases, again, the devotion to Greek life goes into an enormously large scale. Look at little statues and big ones. One of my favorite examples, because people sometimes have heard of it, is on one of these little islands that end up becoming a Greek territory. They end up building just about the largest statue ever, known as the Colossus of Rhodes. Colossus is just a huge statue. It was a statue of the Greek god of the sun. And supposedly, this statue was so big that in the harbor, its two legs basically straddled the harbor. So you'd have to go sail underneath it to enter into this area. The statue is no longer standing, which is of course why I'm showing you this 19th century image of the statue. But there's other things that are a little more serious for our purposes. For instance, in Alexandria in Egypt, they founded one of the great libraries of the ancient world. And the first basically a graduate center for research, also is founded at the same time. And, I love the Library of Alexandria, because they have the most aggressive lending policy of all time, which is that if anybody who entered the city, you happen to have books that they didn't already have a copy of, they had the right to take your books and keep them as long as it took them to make a copy of them, and then they would return them. Because there was this lust to have all of the knowledge, especially Greek knowledge, but any knowledge, in one place. So, in essence, this is really, in some ways, the true legacy of Alexander the Great, the spread of Greek culture. Even when, again, his attempts at governing had really badly failed, we do think that later conquerors, like the Romans, would look to him then as a model. This is a man, this is how you conquer. And they tended to gloss over some of the less successful parts of his life. All right, folks, thanks. I will see you then on Friday. All right.